Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz, and this season we will be unpacking real trends, hot topics in the workplace around allyship and inclusion. Our goal is that each week you leave with tangible tools, information, practical strategies that you can take back to allies at your organization. Let's dig in to this week's topic. Welcome, listeners. We have a special guest this week. John Hackston is the chartered psychologist with over 30 years of experience in helping clients to use personality assessments in a wide range of contexts. He's the head of thought leadership at the Myers-Briggs Company, where he leads the company's Oxford-based research team. He's a frequent commentator on the effects of personality type on work and life, and has authored numerous studies, published papers, and peer-reviewed journals. He's presented at conferences for organizations such as the British Association for Psychological Type, who would have thought, and has written on various personality type related subjects in top outlets such as Harvard Business Review. And some of his most recent research focuses on diversity and inclusion in the workplace and sustainability in organizations through the intersection of personality type and neurodiversity. How fun, John. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, I want to dig in first with how does somebody get into personality-based research? What does that career path look like?
In my case, it comes from being a psychologist. So that's my background. I'm a psychologist, I'm a chart psychologist. I began my career in research, then moved into consultancy and training, and now I've come full circle back to research again. But a lot of the things that I've done have revolved around trying to understand people through different forms of psychometric assessment, including personality. So personality type, things like the Myers-Briggs type indicator is probably where I've used the most in terms of looking at people's personality.
So I know the big question you help organizations and people with is, how does personality impact the way we work? That's a big question.
Well, I could say, in what ways does personality not impact the way we work?
Right.
Because it has all sorts of effects. It affects the way we work let's take a typical working day. Perhaps you have a meeting with a number of meetings in your working day. In preparing for a meeting, are you somebody who wants to think about things beforehand or just react there in a moment? Are you someone who wants to talk a lot in the meeting, talk your thoughts out, or think about things before you talk? All of those are to do with extroversion, introversion, one aspect of personality. Are you looking at the big picture and you want to have the target first, the big picture and the vision, and not worry about the details unless you need to? Or do you need to build up from the details upwards? Another aspect of personality. Are you looking at the task and the logical solution? And are you trying to get to that logical solution? Or are you thinking, hang on a second, there's people involved here, people are important. And how does this relate to my values and what we should be doing? Something called thinking and feeling, another aspect of personality. And very obviously, are you somebody who likes to work through things in an organized fashion, in a structured fashion, ideally finish tasks well before time? One of those people, a little bit like me, who actually gets a real buzz out of doing things at the last minute. All of these are different ways in which, and there's so many more, in which our personality affects the way we work. I guess if we're not aware of that, we just wander through life not noticing or caring about the damage that we're causing. But once we know about these things, we can understand how we work with other people, how we can interface with other people more effectively, and that will really improve and affect the way that we work.
Yeah, there's a lot of upside to understanding our own personalities from a self-awareness perspective.
Absolutely.
But of course, the personalities of others. And I'm curious, John, thinking about personality, and I like how you laid out like task-oriented, people-oriented, extroverted, introverted, all these different aspects of it, and goes way beyond that. But if you think about just a few dimensions of difference amongst personality, if you
Okay.
could pinpoint a few continuums or maybe kind of point our listeners to what are some things that tend to operate as far as difference in personality?
Okay. The model of personality, there's many odd different ways to look at personality out there. The model of personality that we use the most is around what's called personality type, using the Myers-Briggs type indicator assessment. And that really looks at four aspects of personality. First of all, it looks at what we've already mentioned, extroversion, introversion. And this isn't about extroverts enjoying dancing on tables, introverts hiding in the corners. It's about where we focus our attention and where we get our energy from. Is it from the outside world of people and things for extroversion, or inner worlds of thoughts and feelings? And that has effects on all different aspects of our personality, which we've touched on already. Things like, do we like to think things through first or talk things through? Do we like to get straight into action or reflect first? Do we tend to want to communicate by talking, or actually perhaps we like to get our thoughts in order and put it down in writing? All of these different aspects of personality. Second one that's useful to look at is called sensing and intuition. And this is about the sort of information that we prefer and the sort of information that we trust. Do we prefer and trust information which is solid, which is based on our experience, on the evidence of our five senses, which is why we've called that sensing? Or do you prefer information which is about how things combine together in a big picture and where things are heading in a vision? Intuition. Now, all of these are preferences. We'll have preferences for one side or the other. We can go to the other side if we need to do so, but it takes energy. We tend to stay to our own side where we can. Then something we touched on, thinking and feeling. Do we like to make decisions according to objective logic, or do we prefer to make decisions according to our values and how people will be affected? And you can see these things playing out at work and in other cases. So if you say to somebody, how are things going at work? Someone with a thinking personality preference would tend to say, we're working on this project, and this is happening, and that's happening, and that project's going well, that's not going so well. Oh, and did you know that Marie's getting married? Where someone with a feeling preference would just say, oh, did you know Marie's getting married? It's great, it's taken so long, and it was all going to happen before COVID, then it couldn't, and then no, but it's finally happening. Oh, by the way, we're working on this project, and this project, and this project. So we cover them both, but our first impulse is to go in one direction or the other. And last but not least, judging and perceiving. This idea of the extent to which we like closure in our lives. People who have a judging preference want things closed down. They want to make a decision and move on. They like things structured. They like things organized. People with a perceiving preference like to keep their options open. They will make a decision, but only at the last minute if they can help it, because, hey, information is coming in all the time. And maybe they make a better decision if they hold it off to the end. And that can really annoy those judging people because saying, well, let's decide this, let's make this happen. And the perceiving people say, well, we don't need to yet. But again, once you understand where the person is coming from, you can work out a way in which this can happen. In work and also at home, of course. And many people will recognize some of these features, I'm sure, in themselves and maybe in their spouses or partners or other important people in their lives as well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, personality is not a work or home thing. It's both. It's a both
Absolutely.
and thing. Yeah, interesting, John, those continuums. So if anyone's familiar with Myers-Briggs, the assessment, it's a fairly, well-known one across those four continuums, like you said. And what's interesting for me as I was reflecting as you were going through that, I've always been, since I first assessed it, always an
Mhm.
ENFJ.
Okay.
So extroverted, intuitive, feeling and judging.
Absolutely.
What's interesting is after I went through grad school and got my MBA, the only thing that changed was I went from an F to a T, which I think was because
Okay.
they kind of conditioned you to be a thinker with data and turn off those feelings.
And the important question is, have you really become a T or has your behavior just become that way?
Right,
Who's a
right,
real you? Yeah.
right.
Uh,
I'm more of a feeler for
yeah.
sure. I'm sure that's
Yeah.
if I checked it now, it's probably swung back the other direction. But I just kind of wanted to tee up, how much does personality change over time, or does it at all?
So what the theory suggests is that underneath it all, your personality, your basic personality doesn't change.
Mhm.
And what research suggests is, and this is a terrible generalization, but roughly half of who you are is about that inbuilt personality. Half of who you are is about everything else that's happened in your life. It's about your upbringing. It's about, for you, grad school. It's about your job. It's about your home life. It's about all the people around you. It's about what's happening right now, this second. So I myself have an introversion preference, but given what I'm doing at the moment, I'm probably not going to sit here quietly going, because that's really not what the task requires.
That's so fun. Yeah. Yeah. So personality is kind of a mismatch of nurture and nature, it sounds
Yeah,
like.
and rather perhaps than a mismatch, it's nurture building on the nature. So you start in
Mm,
some place, but that's affected in all sorts of ways by everything that's happening in your life. I think it's useful to pull apart this idea of behavior, what we do,
hmm.
and your inner personality, perhaps who we are at our
Yeah.
core.
Yep.
This idea, for example, of, as you say, for your example, thinking and feeling. The idea was that underneath it all, you're always that feeling person. So you
Hmm.
are a choice to one side or the other, in effect. But your
Hmm.
behavior can go all across the
Right.
spectrum, depending on where you are. One thing we sometimes say is your personality type, and as you said yourself, you end up with these four letters, describing one of 16 types, is like you live in a house with 16 rooms. Very big house, but it's got 16 rooms. And actually, there's one room which is your favorite room, which you tend to live in as much as you possibly can. But you're going to visit other rooms for different purposes. You're going to go to the kitchen, you're going to go to the bathroom, you're going to go also different rooms when the occasion demands, when the occasion needs it, but you'll come back to your favorite room as and when you can. So we all have our own type, but we can flex our behavior to fit the situation. And there's something
Hmm.
about knowing where your home is, which actually, and knowing where you can come back to, which means you can actually flex your type often
Hmm.
much more effectively and much more comfortably because you know we're going to come back to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it just to continue with that metaphor, it's like who built the house, like, and who's the house built for? Because there's certain personalities that tend to thrive in corporate settings. And so I'm just
Oh,
curious,
absolutely.
John, if there is, I think there is a lot of bias we have of like what a leader looks like from these dimensions, for example. Can you speak into how personality can also be linked with maybe some biases?
Certainly. So if we look at what is encouraged in many organizations, not all, but many organizations, and to some extent in certainly in Western culture more generally, it tends to be extroversion rather than introversion. It tends to be sensing rather than intuition, although there are exceptions to that rule. It tends to be thinking rather than feeling, and it tends to be judging rather than perceiving. So many organizations prefer people who will talk things through rather than thinking things through, people who deal with the facts rather than the big picture and the ideas, people who talk about the task rather than the process and the people, and people who act in a structured way rather than in a more open-ended way. Especially larger, more traditional, more hierarchical organizations. And if you look at how people actually behave in organizations, take that last one, for example, judging and receiving, people with judging preference naturally tend to go through a project in a very organized, structured way. They'll go through things, they'll have milestones, they'll hit those milestones, and they'll sort of work with an equal amount of energy across each of those milestones. They won't leave things to the last minute. If you look at someone with perceiving preference who's adapted to that structured organization, if you look at them from a distance, it'll look as if they're doing exactly the same thing. They're getting these milestones and hitting those milestones. If you go really close up, what you'll see is that In each of those milestones, they're doing a perceiving thing. They're leaving things a little bit to the last minute for each of those individual things, and then they do it because they still get that burst of energy at the end. So people find ways to work around this, but yes, those biases exist in many organizations. And to answer your larger question about leadership, it does mean that many organizations favor people who have extroversion preferences, thinking preferences, judging preferences, in particular, to move on to leadership roles. And that has an effect really on diversity.
Yeah.
Because one thing you find across the diversity in organizations, for starters, because you may end up with people of all the same type or very similar personality types at top level, at board level organizations, and then you get into groupthink. There's no diversity of thought. People go down a particular road and turn around and afterwards and think, how the hell did we do that? Why didn't we think wider? Because you're all looking at the same thing, because you're not encouraged to actually think in different ways.
Yeah.
And it'll have an effect on diversity in terms of male and female as well. Now, there's all sorts of, as we know, there's all sorts of biases and things in the way of women rising up in many organizations. We know even that when COVID happened, that had a big effect on women's careers because they disproportionately, even if they're more senior than their husband or partner, tended to take the weight of childcare during that COVID time when kids weren't able to go to school. So there's all sorts of structural and other things which get in the way. We've actually got data because many people take the Myers-Briggs over time from, I think it was about 2 million people over the last 20 years who've taken the Myers-Briggs, and we know their gender and we know what level they reach in organizations. What you find, not surprisingly, sadly, is that women are much less likely to reach the top levels in organizations, about half as likely as men are. We look at our data over the last 20 years, you see that situation's getting better, but it's getting better very, very, very slowly. If our data continue in a straight line, maybe by about 2095, things be equal. But of course, that's assuming things go in a straight line, and many other things may come along before then.
Yeah.
But one of the other things that you find is that it interacts with personality. So in a population as a whole, men are more likely to have a thinking preference than women. Women are more likely to have a feeling preference than men. And that's not just a Western society thing, an American thing. We can see that throughout the world in lots of different societies. And that in itself is neither positive or negative, but because organizations tend to encourage that thinking approach, it means that women are less likely to reach the top levels. It's another factor that can get in the way. And that is a bad thing in so many ways. But when you look at the data in more detail, what you can see is that men at the base level of organizations have roughly the same proportion of thinking preferences as men at the top level organizations. Women at the top level organizations are much more likely to have a thinking preference for women at bottom level organizations. So for a man, it doesn't matter what your personality is to an extent. For women, it really has to have a thinking personality preference. So you're getting a bit of a double whammy.
Yep.
Getting in the way of women reaching those top levels.
I'm just guessing, but if you have research on this, I would guess that women aren't necessarily more likely to be feelers versus thinkers. A lot of it has to do with how we socialize gender. And like you said, in a global phenomenon, I mean, women are more of the primary caretakers. So being intuitive and being feelers would probably make sense if that's how you're being socialized and that's what your role is deemed to be in society. But you're also pointing to another trend, which in the diversity world we call covering. And I'm just thinking about my grad school experience covering, becoming more of a thinker because I was in a room full of thinkers. You know, you try to blend in just like the women that advance more to senior leaders who try to take on the personality of the group. And it's such a disservice because the value you bring to the group is the diversity of thought and the diversity of
Absolutely.
background. So you're losing that added benefit.
Absolutely. And that conversation we're just having here is exactly the same conversation I've had with people who are on our training courses learning to use a Myers-Briggs type indicator. And many women are saying very much the same sort of thing. That they thought they were here, then they had to be like this, but actually they're over here because those things are getting in the way.
And it's a lot of mental energy. It's like, which version of me can be okay in
Yeah,
this
yeah,
environment? And there's no way the
absolutely,
organization's getting the
absolutely.
most out of them if they're having to pretend to be a different version of themselves.
Yeah. And, there's also things come into place as well. So it interacts with this idea of the glass cliff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's other research out there which shows that several pieces of research, not from us, from other academics, that show that senior managers and senior leaders who have a more transformational, people-centered learning style actually do good for the company commercially, which actually plays into the idea that perhaps we should be thinking about having a more varied style at the top. But I know of another piece of research which says that senior leaders which have that style are rated as less effective by other members of the board and other senior people in the organization. So there's a big learning job to do there. And I think perhaps one of the ways that learning about personality can help in a small way is just by starting to recognize that you're not the same as other people, but other people will do things in a different way, but that actually could be quite useful. And if you work together and have both different ways of doing things, this could be more effective than everyone just doing things in the same way. And I can help to break down that picture. But
Yeah.
it's a long, hard slog.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I like the house analogy going back to that. It's like, let's have a little bit of every room in the house of the
Just, yeah, as far
organization.
as you can. And we know that, teams which are more diverse in personality terms make better, more rounded decisions. Again, there's research which says effectively that if you have a situation where people are doing fairly low level tasks, everything's always the same, there's no ambiguity, there's no change particularly, but actually having a less diverse team is actually, you get better results. But hey,
What fantasy world are they?
exactly. More diverse teams in personality terms will make better decisions in most of the situations we find ourselves in. It takes longer, perhaps, because there's more different points of view. There's more conflict because of different points of view. But actually, if you are able to take the time and recognize that those people may have a valid viewpoint, which is again where understanding of people's personality comes in, you will make those better, more rounded decisions.
Yep. 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 Yeah. Yeah. There's not a lot of downsides to having a diverse team other than it takes a little longer to make a
Yeah,
decision. But if the decision's better, isn't it worth a little bit more time?
absolutely. Yeah.
John, I want to wrap up our interview with linking this to diversity and inclusion, right? So, kind of listeners, forgive me, I'm going to kind of draw an analogy here because there is some pushback sometimes when I talk about personality and diversity of thought, being part of diversity. You can kind of rub people the wrong way. They're like, wait a second, race, gender, there's these big, big issues. We shouldn't be avoiding those. And it's like, no, 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 that's not the point here. We're not trying to compete or create a zero-sum game around which dimension matters more. But I think you do raise a good point in your research that for people, especially in the dominant group, for the lack of a better word, mostly white guys that are in these leadership positions that are like, why do we have to like focus on diversity? So it's still the question I get a lot nowadays is I think you make a good case for diversity of personality can be kind of a gateway into exploring other dimensions of difference. And, when I think about that, it's like whatever entry point it takes for people to get engaged in this conversation, I will take it. Right. So how can we use personality to get people into the conversation more?
One of the things that we've been doing is we've been looking at this idea of more inclusive leadership. And there's all manner of different takes you can have on it, more inclusive leadership. Given our expertise, we're approaching it from a personality angle. And what we're doing is helping leaders to understand that perhaps they are not as inclusive as they might think they are when it comes to understanding other people and taking on board other people's points of view. And using personality tools like the Myers-Briggs type indicator to break that down and help them to become more inclusive in their behavior, become more inclusive in interactions, to value other points of view and to value other approaches. And in a small way, that, as you said, is a little bit of a gateway into a wider valuing of diversity. We did do some research a little while ago looking at inclusion in organizations. Sadly, the sort of some of the main findings that you might expect, we found that people in particular groups, people who weren't white and male in particular, or people who felt they couldn't divulge their sexual orientation, felt much less inclusive in other groups. But one of the things we also looked at was leadership. And we looked at people who took part in our survey. Some were leaders, some weren't. And we got them to all rate their leaders on how their manager and how inclusive their manager was. And then we said, and are you a manager yourself? And if they said yes, we got them to rate themselves on how inclusive they felt they were to their subordinates. And it wasn't just a one question, it was a set of questions. And oddly enough, the questions we asked about their manager corresponded to ones we asked them. Guess what happened? What happened, of course, was that they rated themselves as much more inclusive than they rated their manager. So there's this leadership perception gap. People see themselves inclusive when they're not. And again, even just knowing that, having the data behind that, just helps people realize that there's an issue. And again, that's something that we've tied into our inclusive leadership program.
Yeah, that reminds me of self-awareness too. People think they're self-aware, but then when they assess other people's self-awareness,
yeah.
lower.
There's one really good statistic on it. So not about self-awareness, but I've used it to talk about self-awareness because it illustrates the problem. If you ask somebody on a scale of 1 to 10, where 5 is average, how good a driver are you? And I think the study I recall was that 98%, no, I beg your pardon, 87%, I think it was, of Americans said they were above average, which clearly is a statistical impossibility. But yeah, if you ask people how self-aware they are, you get very similar sorts of results. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's because it's almost like you can't see yourself, right? You can't see yourself driving. You can't see yourself leading. You don't have the vantage point to
until
have
you
the
sit down
awareness.
until you sit down on a sort of structured program where you go through things and see yourself as others see you, then that really starts to have the fat.
Yeah.
And it is also the case, and we've done some research in this in the past as well, that as have other people, that men tend to have a more inflated view of their own abilities than women do. Just to add a little bit of spice into that picture.
Yeah, it reminds me of the research on potential versus performance bias that we tend to focus on the dominant group. Well, they have the potential to do it, right? I think there's probably a ego drive that goes with that versus people that are more used to being marginalized tend to be judged on actual performance, which obviously creates some difference.
Which creates a difference. Yeah.
Oh, John, this has been so fun. What great research you have. And listeners, I highly encourage you, regardless of the assessment that you use, I am a big believer that personality assessments can be really helpful to start the conversation in organizations around issues of diversity and inclusion. Of course, that's just one ingredient. You want to keep the conversation, progressing into, other topics as well. But I think we've learned here today, it has an impact on our biases, how we look at leadership, how we look at differences. And if this can be kind of that gateway to the conversation, consider starting there. John, I would love it if you could tell our listeners how to stay in touch with you and follow your work more.
So you can visit our website, which is www.themyersbriggs.com. That's all one word. Or you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm just down as John Hackston, Hackston. And you'll see me sort of hanging out there. So look forward to seeing some of you in the future.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, thanks for the time today. This has been really insightful.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. My hope is that you walked away with a tangible tool, insight, or information that you can share with other allies on the journey. If you liked this week's episode, please leave us a review. Your feedback means a tremendous amount to us. We'll be back next week with another hot topic.